Hi, and welcome to Kids in the Blanket, a podcast made by kids for kids who love to read and for parents who don't have the time to read to them.
This is our 9th episode. Today we'll be reading Little Miss and Mr. books. We'll be reading Little Miss Chatterbox, Mr. Messy, and Little Miss Sunshine. Make sure to listen to the end when we tell our joke of the day, which she did in a bank in Happyland. At 10 o'clock one Monday morning, Mr. Happy strolled into the Happy to Lend You Bank in the middle of Happytown. He took out his checkbook, wrote a check, and went to the counter. Behind the counter, on her first morning at work, stood Little Miss Chatterbox. She smiled at Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy smiled back. "Good morning," he said cheerfully.
"Well,"
said Little Miss Chatterbox, taking a deep breath.
"For the time of the year, it is good morning, but it's not as good as the morning we had yesterday. And I dare say tomorrow's going to be an even better morning. But it's quite a good morning for a Monday morning, And
she went on and on and on until it was time for the bank to close. Mr. Happy was still standing there with his mouth open in amazement. He had been there for hours.
"And now,"
continued Little Miss Chatterbox,
"it's time for the bank to close, and it's time for me to go home. So goodbye, and nice talking to you, And
she went home, leaving poor Mr. Happy without any money. The following morning, she was fired. She got herself another job in a restaurant, the Eat-A-Lot. It was Tuesday morning, and at noon, Mr. Greedy walked into the restaurant and sat himself down at his usual corner table. He always ate there on Tuesdays because it was the day they served extra large portions. The waitress came up to take his order. "What's the soup of the day?" Mr. Greedy asked the waitress.
"Well,"
said Little Miss Chatterbox, for she was the waitress,
"the soup of the day is tomato, but we also have other soups on the menu, such as oxtail, vegetable, chicken, and chicken noodle. But we have lots of other things to start with, such as..." And she went on and on and on until midnight. Mr. Greedy was still sitting there, listening in amazement. He'd been there for 12 hours, listening. "And now," continued Little Miss Chatterbox, "it's time for the Eat-A-Lot restaurant to close and for me to go home. So goodbye, and nice talking to you, And
she went home, leaving poor Mr. Greedy feeling rather empty. The next morning, she was fired. The same thing happened all week long. On Thursday morning, she was fired from her job as an assistant in a hat shop. Miss Splendid went into the shop to buy herself a new hat, but she couldn't.
"Oh, madam, I've just got a hat for you. I know you're going to love it because it's pink and pink is your color in it."
It was all talk and no hat. On Friday morning, she was fired from her job as a secretary to Mr. Uppity. Mr. Uppity, incidentally, was the richest man in the world. I just thought you would like to know. But poor Mr. Uppity didn't make any money the day that Little Miss Chatterbox was working for him. Oh, no!
"Oh, Mr. Uppity, I've never worked in an office before, and it isn't exciting. Would you like a cup of coffee? And you're so rich, everybody... And are you as rich as everybody said you are? And
It was all talk and no work. But this story has a happy ending because at the very end of the week, Little Miss Chatterbox managed to find herself a job that suited her down to the ground and up to the sky. That Saturday evening, Mr. Chatterbox was at home in the Chatterbox cottage, which is where he lived. Mr. Chatterbox was mad because his watch had stopped and he had arranged to meet Little Miss Sunshine at 7 o'clock, and he had no idea what the time was. So he decided to call the time to find out what time it was. He dialed the number.
At the tone, the time will be 6:25 and 15 seconds.
Little Miss Chatterbox took a deep breath. Beep!
At the tone, the time will be 6:25 and 20 seconds.
Beep! That's funny, thought Mr. Chatterbox to himself. That sounds just like my sister.
Little Miss Sunshine
by Roger Hargreaves.
Welcome to Misery Land. We say welcome, but there really isn't very much welcoming about it. It's the most miserable place in the world. Misery Land. Worms look like this. And when the birds wake up in the morning in Miseryland, they don't start singing. They start crying. Oh, it is a really awful place. And the king of Miseryland is even worse. He sits in his throne all day long with tears streaming down. Oh, I'm so unhappy, he keeps sobbing over and over and over again. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Little Miss Sunshine had been on vacation. She'd had a lovely time, and now she was driving home. She was whistling happily to herself as she drove along when out of the corner of her eye she saw a sign. To Miseryland.
Miseryland?
She asked herself.
I've never heard of that before.
And she headed down the road leading to Miseryland. She came to a sign that read, You are now entering Miseryland, smiling, laughing, chuckling, giggling, forbidden by the order of the king. Oh dear, thought little Miss Sunshine as she drove along. She came to a castle with a huge door. A soldier stopped her.
What do you want?
He asked gloomily.
I want to see the king,
smiled little Miss Sunshine.
You're under arrest,
said the soldier.
But why?
Said little Miss Sunshine.
For a very serious crime,
replied the soldier.
Very serious indeed.
The soldier marched little Miss Sunshine through the huge door and across a courtyard and through other huge doors and up an enormous staircase and along a long corridor and through another huge door and into a gigantic room. And at the end of the gigantic room sat the king, crying his eyes out.
Your Majesty,
said the soldier, bowing low.
I have arrested this person for a very serious crime.
The king stopped crying.
She smiled at me,
said the soldier. There was a shocked silence.
She did what?
cried the king.
She smiled at me,
replied the soldier.
What?
But why is smiling not allowed?
Laughed little Miss Sunshine.
She laughed at me,
cried the king.
Why not?
She chuckled.
She chuckled,
wailed the king. Little Miss Sunshine giggled.
She giggled,
blubbered the king. And he burst into tears again.
But why are these things not allowed?
asked little Miss Sunshine.
Because it's Miseryland,
wept the king.
And they never been allowed.
He sobbed.
Oh, I was so unhappy before you arrived.
He wailed.
But now I'm twice as unhappy.
Little Miss Sunshine looked at him.
But wouldn't you like to be happy?
she asked.
Of course I would,
cried the king.
But how can I be? This is Miseryland.
Little Miss Sunshine thought.
Come on,
she said.
You can talk to me like that,
sobbed the king.
Don't be silly,
she replied, and she led him across the gigantic room and through the huge door and along the long corridor and down the enormous staircase and through the huge door and across the courtyard and through the huge door to her car.
Get in,
she said. Little Miss Sunshine drove the crying king back to the large Miseryland sign.
Dry your eyes,
she said, and handed him a large handkerchief from her purse. And then from her purse she pulled out a large pen. 5 minutes later she finished. Instead of the sign reading, You are now entering Miseryland, smiling, laughing, chuckling, giggling, forbidden by the order of the king. Do you know what it read? You are now entering Laughterland, smiling, laughing, chuckling, giggling, permitted by the order of the king.
There,
said little Miss Sunshine.
Now you can be happy.
But I don't know how to be happy, sniffed the king. I never tried it.
Nonsense,
said Little Miss Sunshine. It's really
very easy.
She smiled. The king tried a smile.
Not bad.
She laughed. The king tried a laugh.
Getting better.
She chuckled. The king tried a chuckle.
You've got it.
She giggled. She giggled. The king looked at her. So I have. I'm the king of Laughterland.
Hey.
As Little Miss Sunshine arrived home, there was Mr. Happy out for an evening stroll.
Hello.
He grinned.
Where have you been?
Miseryland.
She replied.
Miseryland?
He said.
I didn't know there was such a place.
Little Miss Sunshine giggled.
Actually,
She said.
there isn't.
Mr. Messy. By Roger Hargreaves.
Mr. Messy was the messiest person you have ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name and messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, there were tiles missing from the roof, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds, the garden gate was off its hinges, and had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his yard lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up, brushed his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a broom he'd left lying on the yard 2 weeks before. There was a forest behind Mr. Messy's messy house with the messy yard, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large forest with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right through the forest until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the forest? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage he had ever seen. It had a lovely little yard with a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the yard clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached.
Good morning. I'm Mr. Messy,
said Mr. Messy.
I can see that.
Replied the man, looking at him up and down.
I'm Mr. Tidy.
And I'm Mr. Neat,
said another man, appearing out of the house.
Tidy and neat,
said Mr. Tidy.
Neat and tidy,
said Mr. Neat.
We're in business together.
Explained Mr. Tidy.
And the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them.
What sort of work?
Asked Mr. Messy.
Oh, we make things nice and neat,
said Mr. Neat.
Tidy things up,
added Mr. Tidy.
Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you,
said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning.
But I don't want things neat and tidy,
said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it.
Nonsense,
said Mr. Tidy.
Fiddlesticks,
said Mr. Neat.
But,
said Mr. Messy.
Come along,
said Mr. Neat.
Off we go,
said Mr. Tidy.
But,
said Mr. Messy.
But nothing,
said Mr. Neat, and bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house on the other side of the forest.
Good heavens,
said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived.
Good gracious me,
said Mr. Tidy.
This is the messiest house I've ever seen in all my born days,
They both said together at the same time.
Better do something about it,
said Mr. Neat, and before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there around Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed and pruned and snipped and clipped and cleared and dug and made the yard look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed and rubbed and painted and mended and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house.
Good heavens,
Said Mr. Neat for the second time this morning.
Good gracious me,
Said Mr. Tidy for the second time this morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever been before.
There we are,
Said Mr. Tidy.
all finished.
Said Mr. Neat.
tidy and neat.
Said Mr. Tidy.
Neat and tidy.
Said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy.
Precisely.
Replied Mr. Tidy.
What we're both thinking
They said together to Mr. Messy.
is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this. But
Said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him right into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy brushed and washed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror.
you know what I have to do now?
He asked in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried.
What
What are you going to have to do?
I'm going to have to change my name.
Said Mr. Messy, and then he chuckled, and then Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled, and then Mr. Messy laughed, and then Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed, and then they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that is really the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have a visit from two people. And you know what they are called, don't you?
And now for the joke of the day. What do sheep do on sunny days? Have a barbecue. Thanks for listening, and make sure to subscribe to Kids in a Blanket podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Kids in a Blanket podcast was hosted by Lucas, Ellie, and Ethan Immerman. Sound engineering by Ethan Immerman. Original song and editing by Lucas Immerman. And production by Ellie Immerman.